Hi everyone, Zimetry here, and welcome back to another Blender tutorial. So you want to learn about shaders? Well, today we got you covered. Before we get any further into the video though, be sure to like and subscribe down there, please. Helps a lot. That way you never miss out on any tutorials and stay up to date with what I'm creating and what I'm working on. Today I'll be showing you some basic shaders. We'll get into a little more advanced shaders like gradients and marbles, and we'll even make a toon shader. And I'll even touch on some environment shading and techniques that I use when I make my environments. So stick around because there is a lot to cover and we're gonna get right into it. Let's go! Let's open up Blender and get started. Today I'll be going over some basic shaders and some more advanced shaders. I'll touch on how to shade an environment and how to get a good mixture of multiple textures and shaders. That way there's not noticeable tiling. So one of the things I'll be using today and something that you'll need if you're following along is Blender Kit, and that's this add-on right up here. It's a free add-on. You just have to go to blenderkit.com and download Blender Kit right here. And when you have it downloaded, all you have to do is go to Edit and Preferences and go to Add-ons and Install from Disk right here. And when you install it, you will get a Blender Kit online asset library right here. Just make sure it's activated, and when you restart Blender, you should have this bar right up top. And while we're here, make sure Node Wrangler is activated too. Now that we went over what you'll learn and the add-ons that you'll need, let's start this tutorial like many others and select all with A and delete. Let's go ahead and add in a cube with Shift A and Mesh Cube, and let's bring it up to the floor. We're going to start with a cube for the basic shaders, and then we'll get into more complex shapes as we get further into this tutorial. So you probably have a basic understanding of shaders, or you've probably done a few modeling tutorials and you're thinking, well, I want to color and shade this dang thing now. So I want to go over some of the basics of shading and the navigation for it. So first, there's a couple ways we could start shading, and that's up here in the shading window. So here it brings up a whole new workspace for shading specifically. It's pretty handy. There's also another way you can do this, which is by dragging up this window here and clicking this drop down menu with the clock icon, and in the general selection select shader editor, and then what we want to do is switch to material preview or render preview. This is material preview and render preview, and it's only dark because we don't have a light in the scene right now, which you can fix by turning off the scene world. And when you turn off scene world, you'll be able to switch up the HDRI and the rotation and strength of it. I always like this sunset view right here. I like the colors and contrast it provides. Another good thing to know is about UVs and UV unwrapping. So when you're shading something, you may want to unwrap the UV. So if you jump into edit mode and with all faces selected, we could hit the shortcut U for unwrapping, and we could do a basic unwrap or a smart UV project. So if you have multiple sections of a character or a design that you want separated, this would be the one to use, and you can separate the islands and be able to organize it pretty cleanly. The normal unwrap is for a quick and fast unwrapping. One other thing to know with UVs is that you can mark seams within your model. So with edge select mode on, we could select around this edge here, so this face, and if we right click, go down to mark seam, that is now marked as a seam. So when you mark a seam, what you're telling your object and when you're texturing is that the texture will stretch over every other face and then repeat the texture again onto this face. I use seams a lot when I'm texturing the clothing for a character, and when you're texturing clothing, you end up actually putting seams where seams go. For these basic shaders though, we won't need the seam. So let's go ahead and Control Z And when we unwrap our UVs, we could go ahead and select, and you can right click and go to unwrap faces, or you could push U and unwrap, and what that does is it gives us a UV map now of our object. And when you have more complex objects, this is where seams and dividing the UV into islands becomes handy, and the Smart UV project works out a little better. For the first shader that we're going to make is a basic shader, and we're just going to play around with the principled BSDF. So you get that shader by just clicking new, and it's what we start out with for every material. What we can do is rename this basic shader. And here in the principled BSDF, you can change the base color, whether it's metallic or not, the roughness, IOR, alpha, and then a bunch of other different options. And like I recommend with a lot of stuff in Blender, just experiment and see what a lot of these things do. So with the principled BSDF selected, let's change the color. Let's go for like an orange, maybe a red orange. And look at that, you got your first shader. Just kidding, it's going to get a little more advanced than this. What I do really like about Blender is that the default shaders almost have this vinyl, plastic, or art toy look to them just naturally. A quick thing that we can do to the shader is make it shiny, so you just need to bring down our roughness. And you can see that the reflection increases the more you drop the roughness down. Might be able to see this a little bit better on a darker color, so let's go with like a dark blue. And then same with the opposite, you can bring the roughness up and it looks more like a wood block or a solid plastic block now, and there's no reflection to it. But with the roughness down, we can increase the metallic now, and this will make it more metal. Another easy texture we can do with the principled BSDF alone is, what we could do is add in some emission and make our objects glow. So all we need to do is increase the strength a little bit, and you can change the color of your glow. Another basic shader that we can do is a gradient texture. So to add a gradient texture on top of our material, all we need to do is Shift A, just like object mode, and search gradient texture. Let's plug that into base color, and now you can see we have a gradient on our cube. To have more control over this gradient, what we want to do is add in a color ramp. So go to search and add in a color ramp. And then with the gradient texture selected, hit Control T, and that will map our texture to the object. And if you play around with the color ramp, you can see it edits our shader and where the gradient goes. And if you watch my last tutorial on how to make a 3D cake in Blender, I used this technique for when I made the rainbow cake and getting the rainbow frosting onto a cake slice. So what you can do is you can switch the colors up here. And you can also add in more colors to our gradient. You could also edit the color ramp by switching the linear option to B-spline for a more smooth gradient, or you can do a constant so it separates the colors evenly. And in our mapping node, you can actually move the texture around and scale it up. What if we want to make this shader see-through now? All we'll need to do now is mix the shaders with a translucent shader. So Shift A, search, and actually let's use a transparent shader. And with Control Shift and holding the right mouse button and dragging down, we can mix the shaders. Mixing shaders can be a lot of fun, and you can learn so much doing it, and you can end up with a lot of awesome looking models and textures. When you start making shaders and shader groups, it's a good idea to stay organized. And to do that, we can select everything in the shader nodes and hit Command J, and that will box it together. And then go to the side menu here and go to Node. And for the label, we can name it Basic Shader. And this is a good way to stay organized, and it will help a lot once we get into mixing shaders. So now that we went over a few basic shaders, let's see them all together and how can we have multiple materials in one project file. So I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate our cube here. And when you're making shaders, when we have it named here to save them, we want to push this shield, and that will save your shader within this Blender file. Now let's have our plastic looking shader, and then let's have a shiny shader too. What we need to do is just duplicate the shader here in new material, or you could also click this display number here. So now let's rename this shader to our gradient, and this now can be our basic shader without the gradient. And now let's make our shiny shader. So duplicate again. So now each cube has a different shader. We have our basic rough shader, a basic shiny shader, and a gradient. Now how about we get a little more advanced and do a marble texture. So for a marble texture, it's basically the same startup. It's starting with a new material. Let's go ahead and name it marble. Similarly to the gradient texture, we're going to want to start out with a color ramp. So Shift A, search, color ramp, and let's plug this into color. And I'm going to go for a blue marbled look. Now instead of a gradient texture, let's add in a noise texture. And let's go ahead and increase the detail to 16. And you can play around with the scale as well if you'd like. I'm going to leave it at 5. And now with that set, let's go ahead and map the noise texture. And in between the texture coordinate and the mapping node, let's go ahead and add another noise texture. Now you can see that we're getting the marbled look, or almost like a tie-dye look. On the second noise texture, let's match the detail of 16, and let's drop down the scale to about maybe a 1.3. Now I think that's looking a lot more like a marble. Now all that there's left to do is add in a bump node to add in some surface variation. So back over here at the color ramp, let's add in a bump node. Now with this bump node, all we need to do is plug in the color from our color ramp into the height of the bump. And then let's plug in the normal to the normal. The strength originally is going to be way too high for this cube, so let's bring it down to a 0.029. And then let's just bring our roughness down so it actually looks like a marble. And if you look closely now, you can see that there's some surface variation on the marble. So it fits more like a marble statue or a marble countertop a little bit. And then don't forget to save your shaders. And then just for good practice, let's group it all together with Command J or Control J and label it marble. How about we move on to a scratch metal, ideally for an armor or a sword, blade, maybe for your chisel, and you can sculpt out a handsome Squidward out of this.
Visualize the sculpture within, then gently.
So instead of demonstrating the scratch metal just on the cube, let's go ahead and sculpt out a sword blade. Let's hide this cube and Shift A, let's add in a mesh, a plane. Let's go to the top down with numpad 7 and let's scale it along the y-axis. And let's hop into edit mode and add in some loop cuts here. And one loop cut in the middle. In vertex select mode, let's grab this top one, and on the y-axis, let's move it up. Now let's scale it in to make it more like a blade. Now let's give this sword a little bit of thickness. So with face select mode on, let's select all with A and extrude down a little bit. Let's add in one loop cut around the middle here. With that loop cut select, we can scale it out by pressing S, and then we can lock it on multiple accesses by holding Shift X or Shift Y or Shift Z. For this to get the shape of the sword I'm looking for, we can scale it out a little bit on the X and then scale it out on the Y. Now with our blade made, we can get this scratch metal texture. Add a new material. Let's name it scratched. Let's name it scratched metal. Now a scratched metal shader is super simple. All we need to do is start out with a metal. So go ahead and change it to a gray color. And bring our metallic up to 100% and bring our roughness down. Now that we have a metal shader on here, all we need to do is manipulate this principled BSDF and we can easily add in some scratches, grunge, anything, and you can get that stuff off of Google. I just Google image search scratch textures, grunge textures, anything like that, and I look for black and white images that are large enough to be high quality to add in these scratches. So for example, this is what I'm going to be using. Just an image I got off of Google. All we need to do is add in a image texture. So search image texture. Let's add it in here and let's go ahead and open up our image that we downloaded. Now with our image loaded in, all we need to do is map it. So Control T to map it and add in a color ramp. Plug the color of your image into the factor, and then on our principled BSDF we plug our color into our roughness. So just go ahead and play around with these sliders on the color ramp until you have a texture that you're happy with. Now we have some scratches on our sword. And you might be seeing the stretched out image on the edge here, and there's an easy way to fix that. So we can go ahead and jump into edit mode here, and with that, and with the edge of the blade selected, this edge here, we could go ahead and mark that as a seam. With all faces selected, we could go ahead and unwrap, and that should fix our problem. Now you have a scratched metal. Now that we can give David some color and we can make some dragon sashimi, how about we move into a toon shader, since that's been pretty trendy lately with all the new animated movies using that 2D style but in a 3D animation. Now for this toon shader, let's use a more complex shape, and you can use Blender's monkey head in mesh. Monkey. I believe this is Suzanne the monkey. And what you'll want to do right away is add 2 levels of subdivision and shade smooth. That way we'll be able to see all the different shading and different colors with this toon shader. But for me, I'm going to bring in a pug loaf. This will be a good opportunity for me to show you how you could bring in objects from a different Blender file and bring them into your current working Blender file. So you'll just go to File and Append, and then just find the file that you'd like to take a object from. And you can go to Collections and bring in a whole collection, or you can bring in just objects. I'm going to bring in the pug loaf collection. Ah, there she is. Now with all the textures removed, we can join the whole object to make it one. With everything selected, just hit Command J to join. So now that it's one object, we could go ahead and start this toon shader. Let's create a new material and name it toon shader. So first thing for the toon shader, you'll want to add in a shader to RGB. And then in between the shader to RGB and our material output, let's add in a color ramp. And then what we'll want to do with the principal BSDF selected, let's map it with Control T. And let's delete this image texture and reconnect it to our base color. Now what we can do is add in some different colors to add some variation, and it's not just a black to white gradient. Now you can see we're getting the simple look of a toon shader right now. But you can mess with this color ramp and change it to constant. Now we have more of a cell shaded look to our figure. Adjust these colors on the color ramp to something that you like. I'm liking the look of this toon shader already. But now we can mix in some variation to add in some different noise and different texture to the cells. And to do that, what we want to do is add in a noise texture and another color ramp. Plug in the color of the noise texture into the factor of the color ramp. And then to mix shaders, what you can do is Control Shift and right click over the two color ramps, and that creates a mix color. Or you can search mix color. Let's go ahead and switch the color inputs though. So let's have our colors going into A and our noise texture into B. Let's change this color ramp to constant and increase the contrast to something about that. And let's increase the scale of this noise texture to 100. Now we have these speckles almost like street art. And what you can do as well is increase the detail to make these speckles more detailed and finite. Now all that's left with this toon shader is to switch our mix to a multiply. And now you can see we kind of have that look of the toon shaders that are used in the Spider-Verse or Mitchell's vs. the Machines. And as you can see, this texture will be affected by light sources too. So let's add in a light. Let's bump the power up to 1000. And as you can see, our shader now will react to our environment as well. And play around with these details that you add into these toon shaders. So we can go back into the toon shader and maybe instead of a noise texture, we can use a Voronoi texture. Let's plug the color into the factor here and see what we got. Let's increase the scale to 100 as well, and it gives us just different patterns and stuff that we can work with. See, look at that, we made a pretty sweet texture just by experimenting. And I feel like I should get it on a t-shirt or something, that experimenting is really your way to knowledge and your way to expanding your skills. Just experiment and see what some of these tools do, and I guarantee you're going to learn something and pick up something cool. Now that we know how to shade our models and color them, how about we move into some environments? So for an environment, I'm just going to make a simple plane for us to work with, and I'm going to speed up that process here. So for a lot of my environment textures, I use Blender Kit, or I find the environment textures online and I'll bring them into Blender. So we can open up Blender Kit here by pressing the I and switch it to materials only. Or let's find a forest texture. And I'm liking this one right here with the forest debris, and then this one here with the rocks and forest debris. So let's bring in this one first. So it's obviously pretty huge. The texture is pretty huge on this plane. And when you download textures from BlenderKit, it brings everything in for you automatically. It's pretty nice. And we just need to go to this mapping node here and increase the scale. Let's do a 6. And now you can see what I was talking about earlier with the tiling. You can see that the shader is being repeated over and over again in tiles. But I'm going to show you how to change things up and to mix in another shader so that way it doesn't look so fake and so still and non-realistic. So first things first, before we bring in any other textures, let's group this texture together and label it forest ground. And now let's bring in that rock texture. We could go ahead and group this one as well. And let's label it rock floor. With all that selected, we can go ahead and Control C to copy. And let's move back over to our forest ground. And let's Command V to paste it in. And what we want is the principal BSDF of both of these. That way we can mix them. I'll zoom in a little bit here to see that this principal BSDF to the rock floor is being plugged into our mix shader. And then the principal BSDF for our forest ground is being plugged into there as well. And then our mix shader is being hit to our material output for surface. So now what we can do is create a rock and forest floor mix. And to do so, what we need is a noise texture, a color ramp, and we need to map the noise texture. So from the noise texture, let's plug in factor to factor of our color ramp. To preview materials and nodes in the shader editor, what you can do is Control Shift click on any node you want, and that will preview for our viewport window. Let me hide BlenderKit so we can see here. Oh, you know what else I need to do is unwrap this plane. So with all faces selected, let's unwrap it. Head back to object mode. And in here we can see there's not much to our noise texture. Let's increase our contrast. And let's bump the scale up to a 10 on the noise texture. And then let's just adjust the mapping a little bit. Now with that done, let's go back to our mix shader and plug in our color to our factor here. And now here you can see our noise textures in view now. And what you can see is that the black will be one shader and the white will be another shader that we're mixing. So find something that you're happy with, and then let's go back to our mix shader. And now you can see we have our shaders mixed in. And then to be able to offset the tiling, all you need to do is change the rotation of the shaders mapping on each one. So for the rotation of the Z, let's turn it a little bit. And then let's find a rotation on this forest floor that we like. You can still see some tiling, but that's looking a lot better than what it originally was. You can continue to improve your environments by layering your ground floors, because if you go out into nature now, take a step outside and just look around at how many different layers there are to the ground and the world around you, it's pretty crazy. So the more layers you add in and the more realistic layers you add into your environment, the better off it's going to end up looking. and the more you'll start hiding this tiling. So now from a camera view level, that's looking pretty realistic if you ask me. So I think we covered a lot today. We went over basic shaders, roughnesses, shininess, gradients. We even made a marble texture, some toon shaders. We did a scratch metal, and I showed you how to mix environment textures. I just want to thank you all so much for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I hope you learned a lot. We covered a lot today. We went over a lot of different shaders. Expect more shader tutorials. I think shaders could be a good tutorial series. If you have any questions or want to share what you use these shaders on, please tag me on social media, share it down below. Also, let me know what you want to see in future tutorials and some ideas for what you want to see me model and maybe even 3D print. And like always, stay creative and stay safe out there. Peace. Man, these are some really cool shaders. Wish there was a tutorial like this when I first started.